Lily arrived at the Golden River, a beacon of opulence in a city teeming with ordinary restaurants, a place where dreams were plated on fine china and served with hushed reverence. The invitation, clutched tightly in her hand, was her unlikely ticket inside, a fragile hope woven from the cruel threads of a school prank. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen fireworks, cast a warm glow on the impeccably dressed patrons. The air thrummed with the murmur of polite conversation and the gentle music of silverware against porcelain. She had never felt so out of place. The invitation, deceptively elegant on its heavy cardstock with gilded edges, had promised peace, a cessation of the relentless torment she endured at school. Her classmates, the queens of privilege and casual cruelty, had extended an olive branch, or so it seemed. They wanted to celebrate the end of the semester together. The invitation had declared to finally include her. Lily, desperate for acceptance, had allowed herself to believe, to ignore the persistent unease that gnawed at her gut. She'd painstakingly assembled an outfit, borrowing a crisp white blouse from her older cousin and pairing it with a bright red tie, meticulously ironed to banish any hint of her humble origins. Her blonde hair, usually worn loose, was pulled back into a severe bun, mimicking the styles of the wealthy girls she observed from a distance. She sat alone at a secluded corner table, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, projecting an air of belonging that felt utterly false. Minutes ticked by, each one amplifying her anxiety. She glanced nervously at the entrance every few seconds, offering herself excuses for their tardiness. Traffic, perhaps? A last-minute change of plans? Anything to delay the inevitable disappointment. Then, the text message arrived, shattering her fragile hope. A cheerful chime announced its arrival, as if delivering good news. The words on the screen were a brutal punch to the gut. Asterisk. Did you really think we actually invited you? Asterisk below. A string of laughing emojis mocked her naivete, followed by a link to a video. Hesitantly, she pressed play. The video showed 3 of her classmates standing outside the Golden River, their faces contorted with glee as they whispered and giggled, their voices amplified by the phone's microphone. The poor janitor's daughter actually thought she was wanted. One of them sneered. Another zoomed in on the restaurant windows, trying to locate her inside, their laughter echoing with malicious triumph. They were ridiculing her audacity for even daring to cross the threshold of a place they knew she could never afford. Lily's heart constricted, and tears welled in her eyes. The humiliation crashed over her, a suffocating wave of shame and despair. She lowered her head, desperately trying to stem the flow of tears, but they escaped her control, tracing hot trails down her cheeks. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone witnessing her vulnerability, of giving them further ammunition for their cruel amusement. A discreet cough broke through her misery. The waiter, his face a mask of polite discomfort, stood beside her table, a leather folder clutched in his hands. "Miss," he said softly, his voice laced with pity. "The bill is ready whenever you are." Her stomach plummeted. She had ordered the least expensive item on the menu, a small salad, but even that represented a significant portion of her meager savings. She gripped the edge of the table, her throat constricting with panic. I don't have—" The words caught in her throat. She swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. "I was invited. They said they would—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Vocalizing the lie made the truth all the more unbearable. The waiter's expression shifted to awkward sympathy. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole, sparing her this excruciating public display of her inadequacy. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly insignificant amid the glittering grandeur of the restaurant. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears, her chest aching with suppressed sobs. At that precise moment, a chair scraped against the floor behind her. Someone had risen from the adjacent table. Overwhelmed by shame, she couldn't bring herself to turn around, but she heard footsteps approaching and felt a presence looming beside her. A calm voice, deeper than her own but still youthful, addressed the waiter. "I'll pay for her." The world tilted on its axis. Slowly, tentatively, She lifted her gaze, bewildered, not yet comprehending that her life was about to veer onto an unforeseen trajectory. Edgar Milton had not anticipated becoming entangled in a stranger's drama that evening. His father, a man who believed in the importance of appearances and social graces, frequently brought him to establishments like the Golden River, using these outings as opportunities to impart lessons on etiquette and behavior befitting his privileged status. Edgar usually endured these dinners with quiet resignation, consuming whatever delicacies were placed before him and attempting to conceal his boredom while the adults engaged in business discussions that held no interest for him. However, that night, while his father was temporarily absent, engrossed in a phone call outside the restaurant, Edgar had found himself observing the other patrons, his gaze eventually settling on the young woman at the corner table. He had noticed her long before she noticed him. He had seen her smoothing the front of her borrowed blouse, adjusting the knot of her bright red tie, and glancing at the entrance with increasing frequency, as if anxiously awaiting the arrival of someone who was running late. He had witnessed the flicker of confusion on her face when her phone buzzed, followed by the slow dawning of heartbreak as she read the message. He watched her shoulders slump as if weighed down by an invisible burden, and her futile attempt to conceal her tears behind the menu ignited an unfamiliar feeling of discomfort within him. He didn't know her name, knew nothing about her life, but he recognized the unmistakable look of betrayal, a look that, for reasons he couldn't articulate, even to himself, demanded his attention. When the waiter presented her with the bill, Edgar saw the panic in her eyes. He understood the situation unfolding before him, even before he overheard a single word. He rose from his chair instinctively, his actions driven by an impulse he didn't fully comprehend, and approached her table with a calmness he didn't genuinely feel. Up close, she appeared even younger than he had initially thought, her pale lashes damp with tears, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the menu. "I'll pay for her," he stated to the waiter, extending his father's guest card, a card he was strictly forbidden from using except in cases of genuine emergency. He reasoned that this qualified. The waiter, visibly relieved, nodded and retreated, leaving Edgar to focus his attention on the girl. She stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion, as if unsure whether he was real or merely a figment of her imagination, conjured by stress. He sat down across from her, offering neither explanation nor apology. "You don't have to," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her words faltering. "Yes, I do," Edgar replied softly, recognizing the importance of gentleness in this situation. "And before you say anything, you're not a burden, and I'm not doing this out of pity." She averted her gaze, biting her lip, clearly mortified. He could see her struggling to regain her composure, but her carefully constructed facade was cracking under the strain. After a moment of silence, he leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him. "Someone lied to you." She nodded, still avoiding his gaze. They said they wanted to include me. I should have known it was a joke. I always know, but this time, I wanted to believe them." "Wanting to believe people isn't a weakness," Edgar countered. "It just means you still have hope. That's not something to be ashamed of." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if anticipating another insult, but finding none. Her eyes, a clear, reddened blue, were filled with a complex blend of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. Hurt, certainly, perhaps a flicker of pride, desperately clinging to life. Maybe both. Her voice was small when she asked, "Why do you even care?" He paused, considering his answer. He wasn't accustomed to explaining himself, and he certainly didn't want to say anything that would exacerbate her distress. "Because I saw what they did," he said simply. "And because if I were in your place, I'd want someone to step in, too. People should help when they can. It's not more complicated than that." She looked down at her hands, twisting the linen napkin into a crumpled ball. The restaurant lights reflected off her pale hair, giving it a silvery sheen. Edgar noticed the way she held herself, striving to maintain an air of dignity despite the humiliation she had endured. He admired that resilience more than he expected. The waiter returned with the receipt, and Edgar signed it quickly, whisking the folder away before Lillian, though he still didn't know her name, could see the total. When the waiter left again, she exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for an eternity. "I'm sorry this happened," he said. "It shouldn't have." "It happens a lot," she replied quietly, a hint of bitterness coloring her tone. "I'm used to it. My dad is a janitor, so people think they can treat me however they want." Edgar frowned. He had witnessed the subtle but pervasive prejudice that permeated their world, the way adults, who professed to be kind, often treated those without wealth with condescension and disrespect. He despised that hypocrisy more than he ever revealed. "What your dad does doesn't define your worth," he stated firmly. "And anyone who thinks otherwise is wrong." She blinked, surprised by the conviction in his voice. Before she could respond, a gust of cold air swept through the doorway as someone entered the restaurant, and Edgar realized they couldn't linger there indefinitely. "Do you live far from here?" he asked. "I can walk you home if you want." Her eyes widened instantly. No, you don't have to do that. People might see us together, and I don't want you to get in trouble. You're obviously someone important." Edgar almost laughed, not because she was wrong, but because he resented the expectation that he should care about appearances. "I don't make decisions based on what other people might think," he said. "If you don't want me to walk you home, that's fine. But don't refuse because you think you're somehow unworthy." She swallowed and looked down again, clearly wrestling with her internal conflict. After a moment of contemplation, she nodded slightly. "Okay, you can come. Just don't walk too close. People notice things." Edgar didn't argue. He understood more than she realized. As they left the warmth of the restaurant and stepped into the cool evening air, he glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She walked stiffly at first, still visibly shaken, but beneath her vulnerability, he sensed a quiet strength, a steely determination to survive. He didn't know her story yet, or why life had forced her to be so guarded, but he knew one thing with unwavering certainty. Tonight he had stumbled into her life by chance, but he wouldn't be leaving it by accident. They walked in silence at first, the soft echo of their footsteps their only accompaniment on the damp sidewalk. The rain had subsided into a fine mist that clung to the streetlights, transforming them into ethereal halos. Cars passed intermittently, their reflections shimmering across the wet pavement, but the neighborhood was quiet enough that every sound seemed amplified. Lillian maintained a careful distance between them, as if there were an invisible barrier she dared not cross. Though Edgar was careful not to walk ahead of her or behind her, choosing a pace that mirrored her own, she clutched her bag tightly to her chest, her shoulders drawn inward, still tense from the humiliation she had endured. Edgar noticed the way she kept glancing around, as if anticipating the appearance of someone she knew, someone who would judge her for walking beside him. He refrained from commenting. He recognized that some wounds were too raw for questions. Instead, he absorbed the details of their surroundings. The cracked sidewalk, the dimly lit storefronts, the old brick buildings with their rusted fire escapes, attempting to imagine what it must be like to grow up in a place where people were measured by what they lacked. "You didn't have to leave right away," Edgar said finally, breaking the silence with gentle caution. "After what happened, you didn't deserve to run out like that." Lillian shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't want anyone to stare. They already were. I felt like everyone was waiting for me to embarrass myself." Her voice faltered, the memory still painful. "And I guess I did." "You didn't embarrass yourself," he countered immediately. "They did that to you. That's not the same thing." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "It doesn't really matter. People only remember the part that's easy to laugh at." Edgar knew she was right. Rumors in wealthy schools spread like wildfire, eclipsing the truth, and cruelty often proved more entertaining than compassion. Yet, something within him rebelled against the notion that this girl, who had invested so much effort in trying to fit in for a single evening, deserved the ridicule she had faced. They passed a small grocery store with flickering neon lights. A few teenagers loitered near the entrance, but none of them paid any attention to the passing pair. Lillian seemed relieved by their indifference. She relaxed slightly, though she continued to avoid Edgar's eyes. "Do you always eat at places like that?" she asked after a pause, her tone hesitant, as if afraid of offending him. "Not because I want to," Edgar replied honestly. "My father likes dragging me along to those restaurants. He says it's good practice. I think he just wants me to see the kind of people he deals with." She glanced at him, studying him intently. "And what kind of people are they?" He hesitated, then sighed. "People who smile like everything is perfect, even when nothing is. People who care more about appearances than about being decent human beings. People who pretend they're better because they have money." Lillian scrutinized him for a moment, as if reevaluating him entirely. "You don't seem like one of them." "I'm trying not to be," he admitted. "But growing up around them makes it difficult to figure out who you are without all the expectations piled on top." They walked in silence for a few more steps before she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Everyone at school, they always talk about you like you're untouchable, like there's this huge distance between you and the rest of us." Edgar shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "That distance wasn't my choice. My father taught me early that I should keep people at arm's length, that I shouldn't trust easily, that most people want something from me. I guess it became a habit." "So why help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." He looked at her, then really looked, taking in the fine strands of blonde hair escaping her bun, the way her expression vacillated between suspicion and gratitude. "Because trust has to start somewhere," he said quietly. "And I didn't like the idea of you sitting there alone, thinking you weren't worth a simple act of kindness." Lillian stopped walking for a split second, startled by the sincerity in his voice. She wasn't accustomed to hearing such words from anyone, let alone from someone whose life seemed so removed from her own. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but closed it again, unable to find the appropriate words. They continued walking until the city lights faded into a quieter, more residential part of town. Apartment buildings grew smaller, more dilapidated, and the sidewalks were uneven and cracked. A stray cat darted across the road, disappearing into a dark alleyway. Lillian slowed her pace as they approached a narrow building with peeling paint and a porch light that flickered intermittently. "This is me," she said, halting near the steps. "You don't have to come up." "I wasn't planning to," Edgar replied with a small smile, hoping to alleviate her embarrassment. "But can I ask your name now?" She hesitated, then nodded. Lillian Hayes." "It suits you," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Edgar." She hesitated again before shaking it. Her hand was small and cold in his, but her grip was surprisingly firm, as though she wanted to prove that she wasn't as fragile as the night had made her appear. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. You didn't have to do any of it." "I know," he replied, "but I'm glad I did." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. It wasn't friendship yet, not really, but it wasn't indifference anymore either. Something new had begun to materialize between them, something neither of them fully understood. Lillian released his hand and walked up the steps, pausing at the door. Edgar waited until she disappeared inside before turning to leave. As he walked back through the dim streets, he realized that the world he thought he knew had shifted in some subtle but undeniable way. He had stepped outside of his perfect, polished life for a moment, and somehow it felt more authentic than anything within it. Lillian had always been careful about curating her public persona, meticulously concealing the thoughts and emotions she kept locked away inside. At school, she navigated the hallways with quiet anonymity, never interrupting conversations, never challenging the taunts of her tormentors, and never allowing anyone to glimpse the depth of the pain their words inflicted. Unknown to them, she possessed a sanctuary where she could safely harbor all her unspoken thoughts, her fears, and her nascent hopes. It was a worn blue notebook, its corners dog-eared, its cover adorned with peeling stickers. She referred to it as her secret words, though the title was nowhere to be found on its pages. It was simply the one place where she granted herself permission to express herself without fear of judgment or ridicule. After the harrowing night at the Golden River, The notebook assumed an even greater significance in her life. She filled its pages with the details she couldn't share with anyone else. The sting of the cruel prank, the unexpected kindness of Edgar Milton, and the perplexing blend of gratitude and unease that had haunted her in the days that followed. She wrote about how her classmates scrutinized her with increased intensity, how she overheard whispers suggesting that she was attempting to infiltrate social circles to which she didn't belong, and how even her teachers seemed unsure how to interact with her, as if associating with her might implicate them in whatever gossip mill had churned to life. Throughout it all, Edgar maintained a consistent demeanor, which somehow amplified the strangeness of the situation. He didn't hover or act like a savior. He didn't seek recognition for his act of generosity. Instead, he offered brief nods of acknowledgement in the hallways and subtle smiles during group projects, gestures that conveyed his awareness of the events of that night, without attempting to force a friendship she wasn't ready for. He seemed to intuitively understand that she needed space, not because she distrusted him, but because placing her trust in anyone after what she had endured felt akin to walking barefoot across shards of broken glass. One rainy afternoon, Lillian sat on a bench outside the school library, using the precious few minutes before class to pour her thoughts into her notebook. She pressed her pen firmly against the page, struggling to articulate the strange sensation that had taken root in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite define. She was halfway through a sentence when a shadow fell across the paper. Instinctively, she snapped the notebook shut, startled, and looked up to see Edgar standing there, his expression etched with concern. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you," he said, raising his hands slightly as if to demonstrate his harmless intentions. "I just wanted to check something before class." Lillian tried to relax her shoulders, though her heart continued to race. "It's fine. I was just writing." "I could tell," he replied, nodding toward the closed notebook. "Is it for an assignment?" She hesitated. A part of her wanted to fabricate a lie, to claim it was a homework assignment or a journal for English class, something easy to dismiss. But Edgar was watching her too closely, not with judgment, but with an attentiveness that made deception feel unnecessary. "It's personal," she said finally. "I write things I can't really talk about." "Like a diary?" he asked gently. "Not exactly. More like my thoughts before they get too heavy." She looked down at the closed notebook, tracing its edge with her thumb. "They make more sense on paper." Edgar nodded slowly, as if carefully considering his next words. "I won't ask to read it. That's not my place. But if you ever wanted to talk about anything you write, I'd listen." She wasn't accustomed to such offers. Most people her age weren't interested in listening unless it somehow benefited them. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she found herself studying his face, wondering what motivated someone like him to care about someone like her. There was no pity in his gaze, no condescension, just a genuine willingness to offer support if she needed it. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why do you keep being kind? People don't usually do that just because." Edgar sighed and sat down beside her, maintaining enough space that she didn't feel confined. "I guess I'm trying to figure out how to live in a world where being decent isn't considered unnecessary or weird. And if being kind to you helps with that, then I don't see a reason to stop." His answer caused her chest to tighten in a way she hadn't anticipated. She turned away, pretending to adjust her bag so that he wouldn't see the sudden warmth in her eyes. She wasn't crying, not exactly, but the emotion was potent enough that she didn't want him to misinterpret it. Before either of them could say anything more, the bell rang, unleashing a torrent of students toward the building. Edgar stood and offered her a hand to help her up, not insistently, but politely. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it, feeling the reassuring steadiness of his grip as he pulled her to her feet. As they walked toward the entrance together, maintaining a respectful distance between them, Lillian felt the familiar weight of her notebook in her backpack. She realized that perhaps for the first time, the thoughts within it weren't hers to bear alone. She wasn't ready to share them. Not yet. But the knowledge that someone might actually want to understand them filled her with a quiet sense of hope. Edgar didn't attempt to escort her to class or prolong their interaction. He simply said, "See you later," and disappeared into the throng of students, leaving her standing in the hallway with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't friendship, not fully. It wasn't trust, not completely. But it was the nascent stage of something unfamiliar and strangely promising, like the first ray of sunlight after an extended period of rain. And for Lillian, that small beginning held more significance than anyone around her could possibly imagine. The moment Lillian stepped into her apartment that evening, she sensed that something was amiss. The lights were on, but the atmosphere inside felt heavy, causing her chest to constrict. She closed the door quietly, placing her bag down with care, and detected the sound of uneven breathing emanating from the living room. As she peered around the corner, she found her father seated on the floor, his back pressed against the worn coffee table, a crumpled sheet of paper clutched in his trembling hands. His eyes were reddened, not with anger, but with a far more profound pain, a complex mixture of confusion, fear, and humiliation. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" He slowly raised his head, and the expression he wore was one she would never forget. It was the look of a man who had dedicated years to shielding his daughter from the harsh realities of the world, and now felt as though he had utterly failed. He extended the wrinkled paper with trembling fingers, and Lillian knelt beside him to accept it. Her hands trembled as well when she saw the word emblazoned at the top of the page. Termination. "They fired me, Lily," he said, his voice cracked and weak. "They said." A tool, an expensive one, had vanished from the supply room. And wouldn't you know it, they'd found it suspiciously close to her father's cleaning closet. He fought down the humiliation, the shame of physical pressure in his throat. "I didn't take anything. I would never." The words struck Lillian like a blow. She knew her father. Honesty was practically stitched into his DNA. He worked tirelessly those long hours just to keep a roof over their heads. Many a night he'd skip a meal so she could eat. The mere suggestion that he'd stoop to stealing wasn't just ludicrous. It was a cruel injustice. She grasped his hand, squeezing tight, a silent promise. "You didn't. I know you didn't." Her father just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum. "It doesn't matter what I know. They've already made up their minds. They wouldn't even hear me out. Said the security report was enough." He looked up at her, and the naked devastation etched on his face made her heart clench. "I don't know what we're going to do." The fear that had been lurking, a constant shadow all year, the fear of losing the fragile security they'd managed to build now exploded inside her. A sudden, violent storm. She stood abruptly, unable to stay still as her thoughts raced. Money had always been a tightrope walk, but they'd survived because her father never complained, never lost hope, never let the world break him. Seeing him like this ignited something fierce and desperate within her. "Who owns the building?" she asked, though she already knew the answer churning in her gut. Her father hesitated, as if reluctant to name the beast. "The Milton Corporation, the same one Edgar's family owns." She finished the sentence for him, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with chilling clarity. The Milton Corporation. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening, suffocating her. Her father was in the dark about the restaurant incident, the prank, Edgar's unexpected intervention. She'd kept it all bottled up, not wanting to burden him, not wanting him to think she was getting entangled in messes that weren't hers. But now it felt impossible to separate anything. Her humiliation, her father's unjust firing, and the towering, impenetrable world of wealth that loomed over them, all connected by threads she couldn't begin to untangle. Sleep offered no escape that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's trembling hands, heard his voice, a broken record, repeating, "I didn't do it." Anger simmered beneath her skin, a slow burn. Anger at the faceless figures who could destroy a person's life with such casual indifference, and anger at herself for feeling so powerless. She kept replaying fragments of her encounters with Edgar, his calm voice, his seeming sincerity, the way he had looked at her, seeming to see past the surface, and the thought twisted painfully. She didn't blame him, not directly, but she couldn't deny the truth. It was his world, his family, His system of people who operated with the unshakable belief that they were untouchable, that had crushed her father so carelessly. By morning, she was a shell of herself, exhausted and raw. She navigated the crowded school hallways like a ghost, barely registering the noise and chatter around her. When she spotted Edgar near the lockers, engrossed in a conversation with another student about some upcoming exam, her heart lurched with a painful force. She didn't want to confront him, not here, not in front of everyone. But the weight of everything she was carrying propelled her forward, an unstoppable force. He noticed her almost immediately. His expression softened, as if he sensed something was terribly wrong even before she reached him. He began to open his mouth, maybe to greet her, maybe to ask what was the matter. But she cut him off, her voice tight with a raw, barely contained emotion. "Your father fired mine." The hallway seemed to blur, the sounds fading, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own heart. Edgar straightened, his brow furrowing with confusion. "What? Fired him? Why would he? Because someone said he stole something?" she snapped, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "A tool went missing. They found it near his closet and jumped to conclusions. No investigation, no chance to explain. Nothing. They threw him out like he was disposable." Edgar looked stunned, genuinely stunned, and for a fleeting moment, she saw that the shock wasn't an act. But the look on his face did little to ease the burning anger inside her. It only seemed to twist it tighter. "You said your family wasn't like that," she continued, her voice cracking. "You said they weren't cruel. But that's exactly what this is." "Lillian, wait." Edgar took a step closer, reaching out as if to offer comfort, but she recoiled. "You don't get it," she said, her eyes stinging. "You live in a world where people listen to you, where they treat you with respect because of your name. People like us, we get discarded the moment we become inconvenient." Edgar swallowed, looking utterly lost, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know. Let me talk to my father. Let me find out what happened." But Lillian shook her head, taking a step back. "I don't want promises," she said, her voice now quiet, almost a whisper. "I want the truth, and I don't think you can give me that." The words stung, both for him and for herself. But she couldn't retract them. Not when her father was at home, broken and terrified. She turned before he could say anything else, and walked away, gripping her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't dare look back, knowing that if she did, she might lose the fragile strength that kept her from crumbling completely. As she left him standing there in the hallway, she felt, for the first time, that the fragile connection they had started to build was fracturing under the crushing weight of two vastly different worlds. Edgar barely registered the rest of the school day. Lillian's words echoed in his mind, a relentless loop, long after she had vanished down the hallway, leaving him with the unsettling feeling that something fundamental within him had been knocked off its axis. He kept replaying the look in her eyes, the potent mixture of anger, betrayal, and a bone-deep fear. Each replay tightened the knot in his chest. He knew she hadn't spoken out of spite. Her words had been born of pain, a pain so raw it had stripped away all pretense of caution. And the most agonizing part was that he couldn't honestly tell her she was wrong. Not until he knew, with absolute certainty, what had actually transpired. His father was working late in his home office, as usual. The Milton mansion was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the soft hum of electronics and the muffled whoosh of the air conditioning, a sound that had been the background music of Edgar's entire life. He walked down the long hallway, lined with framed awards and ceremonial photos, each one a gleaming testament to his father's successes his father displayed with obvious pride. Those pictures had always made Edgar uneasy, not because he disliked success in itself, but because they felt more like trophies, remnants of a life spent chasing power rather than genuine meaning. He paused outside his father's office door. A sliver of light escaped beneath it, and the faint tap-tap-tapping of a keyboard reached his ears. Edgar hesitated, caught between the urge to simply knock and the equally strong urge to turn and run. His father hated interruptions, and he loathed being questioned even more. But the image of Lillian's father, holding that crumpled termination letter, flashed through his mind, and something inside him hardened. Some things were worth risking discomfort for. He knocked once. When there was no immediate response, he nudged the door open just enough to peek inside. His father wasn't at his desk. Instead, he stood by the imposing wall of filing cabinets on the far side of the room, flipping through documents with a precise, almost mechanical motion. "Dad." Edgar stepped inside before his nerve failed him. "I need to talk to you." His father didn't look up right away. "If it's about that mock debate for school, your tutor is fully prepared," he said, his attention still glued to the files. "And if it's about tennis practice, I've already arranged for extra sessions." "It's not about either of those," Edgar said, feeling a familiar flicker of frustration. "It's about work. Your work." That finally snagged his father's attention. He closed the file drawer with a soft metallic thud and turned to face him, his expression carefully neutral. "What exactly about my work?" Edgar took a deep breath. "You fired someone yesterday, a janitor, Lillian Hayes's father." His father's brow furrowed, as though he were trying to recall a particularly insignificant detail. "Ah yes, security flagged him. A tool went missing." "Correct. Our losses have been increasing. I have little patience for negligence." "But he didn't take anything," Edgar insisted, stepping forward. "He said he didn't. And his daughter. His daughter is irrelevant." His father cut him off sharply. "A corporation cannot function on sentiment. We rely on reports." And the report placed the missing tool in close proximity to his workstation. The decision was straightforward. Edgar clenched his jaw. But what if the report was wrong? What if someone else misplaced it? Did anyone even bother to ask him for his side of the story? "There was no need," his father replied, his tone dismissive. "The tool was accounted for later anyway." Edgar froze, the blood running cold in his veins. "What? Accounted for how?" His father waved a hand, as if brushing away an annoying fly. "One of the contractors found it behind their equipment the next morning. It wasn't stolen at all. Probably just another case of poor organization." Edgar stared at him in utter disbelief. "And you still fired him?" His father gave him a look that suggested Edgar was missing something painfully obvious. "I had already made the decision. Reversing it would look incompetent. Besides, it sent a message that carelessness won't be tolerated." Edgar felt something inside him crack, a brittle tension finally giving way. He couldn't fathom the coldness in his father's voice, the casual way he treated a man's entire livelihood as nothing more than a strategic pawn. He turned away before the anger surging through his veins pushed him to say something he would regret. "Don't go through my files," his father added curtly as Edgar reached the door. "They're confidential." But Edgar was already fixated on the filing cabinet behind him, the one labeled Security and Incident Reports. His father hadn't bothered to lock it, assuming no one in his household would dare to touch it. That assumption was about to be shattered. Later, when the mansion had settled into an uneasy quiet and his father had retreated for the night, Edgar slipped out of his room. He moved stealthily down the hallway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that felt deafening in the stillness. The office door creaked faintly as he pushed it open, but the sprawling mansion swallowed the sound. No one stirred. He walked to the filing cabinet and pulled it open, his hands trembling slightly. The folders were arranged with an almost obsessive precision. He scanned through them, his eyes darting over the labels, until he located the file he needed. Inside, the security report was clipped together in a neat stack. He read it once, then again. The report confirmed everything Lillian had told him. A missing tool discovered near the janitor's closet. Suspicion immediately falling on the nearest staff member. But it was the small, handwritten note at the bottom that caught his attention, a note he was certain his father had conveniently omitted. It read, "Recommend closing investigation quickly. Team prefers to shift responsibility away from contractor crew to avoid internal blame." Edgar's grip tightened on the paper. A wave of heat surged through him, not embarrassment, but a white-hot rage. They had sought the easiest scapegoat, the person with the least power to defend themselves. They had known, from the very beginning, that the evidence was flimsy, but they had used it anyway because it was expedient. He returned the report to its folder, but not before snapping a picture of the final page with his phone. He needed proof. Lillian deserved the truth, and her father deserved justice. As he left the office, he felt a new kind of determination take root within him, stronger and steadier than anything he had felt before. For the first time in his life, Edgar saw, with stark clarity, the vast chasm between the world he had always inhabited and the world he desperately wanted to live in. And he knew that he could no longer stand idly by, watching as innocent people were crushed by decisions made by those who would never understand the consequences. He wouldn't allow Lillian's father to shoulder the blame for something he didn't do. And he wouldn't allow Lillian to believe, even for a single moment, that he sided with the people who had caused her pain. He was going to fix this, no matter what the consequences might be. Edgar didn't sleep at all that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the crushed look on Lillian's face, the quiet despair in her father's eyes, and the cold indifference in his own father's voice. He had always been aware that the Milton Corporation was a machine, efficient and unfeeling, unconcerned with the people it ground down along the way. But this was the first time the cost had a face he cared about. By morning, he had rehearsed everything he needed to say, everything he needed to do, and every step felt heavier than the last. He knew he couldn't approach Lillian without irrefutable proof and a well-defined plan. He had both, but she had no reason to trust him, not after the way their worlds had collided and shattered. He found her beside the school's back staircase, a secluded spot where students rarely lingered. She sat on the cold concrete step, her backpack beside her, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. She looked fragile, as if a single wrong word might shatter her completely. When she lifted her eyes and saw him approaching, her expression hardened instantly. "Please don't," she said before he could utter a word. "I'm not in the mood to hear excuses." "I'm not here with excuses," he replied, stopping a few steps below her so he wouldn't tower over her. "I'm here with the truth." She gave a tense, bitter laugh, the sound strained and empty. "Your truth or mine? Because it seems like they're never the same." Edgar reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear of what he was about to reveal, but from the sheer weight of how desperately he needed her to believe him. He opened the picture of the security report, the one with the damning handwritten note, and offered the phone to her without a word. Lillian stared at it for a few seconds before she took it, her fingers brushing his. Her eyes scanned the report, moving slowly at first, then with increasing speed, and Edgar watched as her pupils contracted, the realization washing over her face in a wave of understanding. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. What is this?" "It's the actual report," Edgar said quietly. "The one they used to justify firing your father. And the note at the bottom, it proves they never actually thought he stole anything. They just didn't want to point the finger at one of their contractors. He was the easiest target." Lillian inhaled sharply, a sound caught halfway between disbelief and raw anger. "So they knew he was innocent, and they fired him anyway?" "Yes," Edgar answered, feeling a profound shame creep over him, even though he bore no direct responsibility for the actions. "And my father knew the tool had been found the very next morning. He just didn't want to reverse his decision because it would make him look bad. Not because your father had done anything wrong." Lillian pressed a hand to her forehead, closing her eyes. For a moment, she was silent, and Edgar didn't dare interrupt her. When she finally lowered her hand, her eyes shimmered with a volatile mix of fury and heartbreak. "So, my dad lost his job because someone in your company didn't want to admit they'd made a mistake." "Yes," Edgar said again, his voice heavy with remorse. "And I'm going to fix it." She shook her head slightly, as if afraid to believe what she was hearing. "How? What can you possibly do?" "I confronted my father," Edgar said. "He tried to dismiss me, But I'm not giving him a choice. I emailed the board this morning with a copy of the report and the note. They can't ignore it, not with written proof. And I told them that if they don't reinstate your father, I'll go public. They can't risk the scandal. Lillian stared at him, completely stunned. For a moment, all the anger she had been carrying seemed to falter, replaced by a disoriented confusion and a faint flicker of something softer. You did that for someone you barely know us. It doesn't matter how well I know you, Edgar said, taking a hesitant step closer. It matters that what they did was wrong, and I refuse to be the kind of person who stays silent just because my last name makes silence convenient. Her eyes softened, but her voice remained cautious. They're not going to punish you for this? They might, he admitted. But if I don't do something, then I'm just proving you right about my world. And I'm not interested in being that kind of Milton. Lillian looked down at the phone, her fingers tightening around it. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, carrying the distant sounds of students arriving for class. But here, on the steps, it felt as if the world had been put on pause. When she finally met his gaze again, her eyes were damp but clearer. What happens now? Now we wait, Edgar said. But you should know something. They're scared. I saw it in the emails I received this morning. They never anticipated that anyone would question their decision. Especially not me. I think they'll try to resolve this quickly. As if summoned by his words, Lillian's phone buzzed with a notification. She frowned and pulled it from her pocket. When she unlocked it, her breath caught in her throat. Edgar didn't need to ask what the message said. He saw her shoulders tremble, her lips parting in disbelief. They want him to meet with a company representative today, she whispered. They're calling it an internal review of procedural misconduct. They're going to reverse the firing. Relief washed over her with such force that she pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to erupt. Edgar felt something inside him loosen as well, a tension he had been carrying since the moment she had accused him of belonging to a world that didn't care. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed, but he didn't look away. Thank you, she said softly. I don't know how to say it any better. You didn't owe us anything, but you still. I was wrong. He interrupted gently. I owed you something. At the very least, the truth. Lillian exhaled shakily and nodded, looking at him with a cautious gaze, as someone might look at sunlight after hours spent in a darkened room, not trusting it fully yet, but desperately wanting to. For the first time since this ordeal began, Edgar felt the fragile connection between them starting to mend. Not because he had magically fixed everything, but because he had tried, because he had chosen to stand alongside her rather than siding with those who had caused the harm. And for Lillian, the simple knowledge that someone from his world was willing to fight for hers was a form of justice she had never expected to receive. Lillian spent the entire afternoon pacing the confines of their small living room, while her father sat vigil beside the phone, anxiously awaiting the call that would ultimately determine their future. When it finally rang, he picked it up with exaggerated caution, as though afraid the fragile hope the call contained might vanish if he breathed too loudly. She watched his face as he listened, her heart hammering against her ribs, saw the initial disbelief, followed by a dawning relief, then something she hadn't witnessed in days, a quiet dignity returning to his posture. When he finally hung up, he covered his face with both hands and let out a breath that shook his entire body. They apologized, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They admitted it was a mistake. They offered my job back. And a raise for the trouble. Lillian launched herself forward and hugged him tightly, tears burning behind her eyes. The weight that had been crushing them for days finally lifted, leaving her lightheaded and drained, but filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He kept repeating the same words, a mantra of sorts. I didn't do it. They know I didn't do it. As if he still needed to convince himself that it was real. That night, she slept for the first time in what felt like an eternity, sinking into a deep, dreamless rest that washed away the sharpest edges of the pain. And in the morning, when she awoke to the warm sunlight streaming through her curtains, her first thought was of Edgar. She remembered the determined glint in his eyes, the unwavering tone in his voice, the absolute refusal to let her father's reputation remain tarnished. She couldn't articulate what drove him to step so decisively across the seemingly unbridgeable divide between their two worlds. But she knew one thing. She owed him more than mere gratitude. She owed him honesty. She found him waiting for her outside her school, standing beneath the wide, sheltering branches of the old oak tree. He wasn't leaning against it or idly scrolling through his phone. He stood perfectly still, his hands tucked into his pockets, as if he had been silently replaying his own thoughts since sunrise. When he saw her walking toward him, he straightened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, as though he couldn't be sure whether she was coming to thank him or to push him away once more. She stopped in front of him, clutching her worn blue notebook, her sanctuary, her secret repository of words, the place where every fear and every truth resided. He nodded toward the notebook. "I remember that," he said quietly. "You were writing in it the day I asked if you wanted to talk. It helps me understand what I'm feeling," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, even though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Sometimes it's the only place where things make sense." He nodded again, the corner of his mouth lifting in the faintest of smiles, but he didn't interrupt her. He seemed to understand that she needed to speak in her own time. She took a deep breath, opened the notebook, and flipped to the very first page. A page she had written months ago, long before the restaurant incident, long before Edgar had even entered her life. She held the notebook open so he could see the words, though her hands trembled slightly. "This was the first thing I ever wrote," she said. "I never intended to show it to anyone, but I think you should hear it." The ink on the page wasn't smudged, but the handwriting was uneven, as if the words had been written through a veil of tears. She read it aloud softly, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I want to believe that goodness exists, but every day I see the opposite." Edgar lowered his gaze, not out of guilt, but because he understood, perhaps all too well, what it meant to lose faith in the things that should be simple. Kindness should be simple. Fairness should be simple. But life had never made it simple for either of them, just in vastly different ways. Lillian closed the notebook gently, holding it protectively against her chest. "For a long time, I felt like people saw me as disposable, like I didn't matter, like I didn't deserve anything good. But you didn't treat me that way, even when it would have been easier for you to just walk away." "I didn't do it to prove some point," Edgar said, finally meeting her eyes again. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because the thought of you going through that alone, it felt wrong." She nodded, feeling a hesitant warmth spread through her chest, not overwhelming, but steady, like a small flame that refused to be extinguished. "My dad got his job back. They apologized. They're giving him a raise. None of that would have happened if you hadn't stood up to your father, to the board, to all of them." "It should have happened because it was fair," Edgar replied. "Not because of who I am. But the truth is," she said gently, "sometimes change only happens because someone chooses to push it. You did that, and I won't forget it." A gentle breeze rustled the branches overhead, dislodging a cascade of leaves that pirouetted onto the sidewalk around them. For a lingering moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the crisp morning air imbued with an unexpected tranquility. Lillian felt the familiar tug of her old instincts, the urge to retreat, to construct walls of self-preservation, to find refuge behind the shield of her notebook and taciturn nature. But this time she resisted. Instead, she took a small step forward, a subtle gesture to bridge the space that had once felt insurmountable, a silent declaration that she was no longer paralyzed by fear. "I don't have a roadmap for what comes next," she confessed, her voice a mere whisper, yet laced with a newfound conviction. "I can't predict if we're destined to be friends, something more, or simply ships passing in the night. But I do know that yesterday, the world felt like it was crumbling around me. Today, that feeling has dissipated. And you played a part in that." Edgar exhaled softly, a visible wave of relief washing over his features. Something warmer, A flicker of burgeoning hope danced in his eyes. "Whatever shape this takes, whatever you want it to be," he responded, his voice laced with sincerity. "We'll navigate it together, one step at a time." Lillian nodded, the simple gesture carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't standing on the opposite side of an invisible barrier. She felt truly seen, not as a label, not as the janitor's daughter or the girl who had endured public humiliation, but as Lillian, simply and completely herself. As they turned and began walking towards the looming presence of the school, now strangely less intimidating, Lillian felt the weight of her notebook shift in her hands. Felt lighter, less burdensome than before. The words within its pages remained her own, their significance undiminished, but something profound had shifted. She no longer felt the crushing weight of bearing them alone. The world around them hadn't undergone a magical transformation, and the scars of the past hadn't vanished overnight. However, the choices they had embraced, the courage they had summoned, the honesty they had extended, the injustices they had begun to unravel, had woven something new into the fabric of their lives, something brighter, something imbued with a quiet, resilient strength. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, perfectly polished and devoid of imperfections, but it was an ending brimming with hope. And for both Lillian and Edgar at this moment, that was more than enough. It was a beginning,